Hi, welcome to the first edition of the Conférence pour le Brésil. Antes de começarmos, gostaríamos de lembrar ao nosso público que o painel com áudio ao vivo em português está disponível em nosso canal no YouTube. My name is Ariella. I hold an MA in Human Rights and Humanitarian Actions from Sciences Po, and I am part of the operational team of the Conférence pour le Brésil. On behalf of the organizing team, I would like to thank you all for attending our educational panel. This conference is organized by Sciences Po Paris students and alumni with focus on overcoming inequalities, 10 years for the Sustainable Development Goals. There will be 13 panels and more than 50 speakers distributed over 7 weeks. In addition to the diligent and voluntary work of our team, we thank our partners TD Setúbal Foundation, Sciences Po's Latin American Political Observatory, Educalibras, and Headline for helping us in the creation of this free online event with simultaneous interpreting into English, Portuguese, and Brazilian Sign Language. Before we start with today's panel, I would like to take this opportunity to invite everyone for our next meeting on November 14th at 11 a.m. Brazil time, in which we will debate culture. We will have the participation of Viviane Ferreira, filmmaker and president of the Brazilian Selection Committee for the 2021 Oscar ceremony, Kimani, composer, poet, and singer, and Eduardo Saron, director of Itaú Cultural, with the moderation of Fernando Eichenberg, journalist and winner of the ExxonMobil Award. So I would like to thank everyone and all the guest panelists and moderators who voluntarily joined us in this debate and made this event possible. And now, today's moderator, Ana Penido, will have the floor to present the panel's theme and introduce our guests. Thank you very much. We have no sound at the moment, no original sound available. Took part in an educational project of SIPO, Educação, and I am the founder of this initiative. So this is a pride to know that someone who started identifying this life project in such a project, in a project we helped create, and these people are now occupying such noble spaces. This is something to be admired of. So I'd love to thank Sciences Po for the invitation, for Tatiana Figueiras for the indication, so that I could mediate this debate. It is a theme that is very dear to me, education, and especially in Brazil, the inequalities that are harming opportunities for adults and children who were born in under unfavorable conditions. We are going to discuss this with very important people. And this is going to be very interesting because we are going to start talking about the 2030 agenda and how the world is dealing with the difficulties in achieving quality education. And we are also going to address the most national drama we have, the inequalities that is in Brazil for being such an unequal country. And also considering the pandemics because it brings a new context on top of it all. And we are heading towards the municipal elections, and the importance of public policies need to be addressed so that we can overcome inequalities. Without further ado, I'd like to start by introducing our first guest, Marlova Noleto. She started a career as a university faculty member, and she has always been engaged in social affairs with governmental and non-governmental entities. When I met her some time ago, some decades ago, she was already working with that, but Marlova played an important role. She started at UNICEF and she's now with UNESCO, where she is now the director and representative of UNESCO in Brazil. So Marlova, you are following the 2030 agenda, especially the goal of quality education. How are we in position regarding achieving such goal? How has the pandemic affected negatively the overcoming of this goal, and what can we do to overcome the obstacles in order to achieve the sustainable goals we have ahead? And what can we do as a country to do about this? Marlova. Well, good afternoon or good evening. Dear Ana Penido, thank you very much for your introduction. It is a joy to be here with you and with all of the other panelists. All of them are great friends, and we share the common cause of education. Our former minister, José Henrique Fernandes, Gina Vieira, Priscila Cruz. She's a professor that is very close to UNESCO and to us. I'd like to thank for the invitation for being here, and on behalf, thank for the invitation of Felipe Lauritzen, I had the honor to work with a bright young person who helped idealize this conference. And I would like to say that this conference is being inserted into a very important milestone, which is a mile of overcoming and reduction of all of our inequalities. Of course, the pandemics, it has opened all the wounds and have shown all of our fragility, and the educational possibilities are still being distributed in a very unequal fashion. We have to remember that way before the pandemic, only 1 out of 5 young children were already excluded from the educational systems. So it is true that the pandemics ended up
So it
creating
is
more
true.
inequality. And it's one of the largest problems of the inequality in the educational systems in history, affecting more than 6 billion students, which represents about 90% of the population that are under school age in the world. But before the pandemics, there was already a very unequal situation in education in the world and in Brazil. But we had, with TD Setúbal, the opportunity to organize last year uh, an event on site in São Paulo, which was a seminar on education and democracy, in which we addressed the inequality on education. And as this is a concern, a long time concern for us. Before the pandemics, around 48 million students of the elementary education were away from school. And of course, part of them were under distance learning regime. So what type of connectivity do these people have? And how does that happen remotely? How does that happen with the distance? So again, what about the teachers? So we again have inequalities in that aspect. It's about access, about connectivity, inequalities, having or not having a computer. The question of reading, if you look at it, most of our students, you will see that some of them have books at home and some do not have books at all. There are families that can help with literacy and homework. Some other families cannot. So the inequality during this pandemic and during the distance learning period, education is charging that price. The pandemic is charging that price, and it's not good. We have good opportunities, but but the losses we had with the prolonged closeout of schools are threatening to, to diminish with the progress we had already achieved by then, especially for young women and children. Around 23.8 million children and young people from the elementary up until the mid school and high school, they may stop having access to school next year just as a result of the economic impact of the pandemic. And this is something we need to pay attention to. So I'd like to remind every one of you that the education is a fundamental right to everyone. It is the basis of society. It includes people. And it's one of the main drives for the sustainable development. UNESCO, every year, they publish a global monitoring report on education, and the data of this report, what we call Gen report, 2020 report, this was produced by an independent team. It brought a worrisome scenario. There has been an increase in the exclusion because of the pandemic, and 40%, around 40% of the low or middle income families could not support students, the most vulnerable students, during the temporary school closeout. It is also a concern that in some countries, school closeout is prolonged way too long. And from the very beginning, UNESCO had disclosed alerts on inequality, saying that it was going to be amplified during the pandemic. And this means that the most vulnerable in countries that are under very underdeveloped stages, they would end up being more impacted. And apart from that, considering the educational systems were also based on distance learning and remote learning, the lower the available connectivity, the lower would be the chance for students to follow up on their classes, and the higher the risk they would have to abandon school. So talking about students leaving schools, they about 24 million students could see a future without schools, or they would abandon their studies into 2021. And in higher education, we could consider that this would be the most affected sector, because students will no longer go to the higher education. It is around 7.9 million students At preschool, the scenario is not as good the same way. We had a 2.8 uh, percentage on students leaving schools. That is also considered with the primary school, with decreasing 0.87%. So what it means is that about 5.25 million girls and 5.07 boys, which encompasses a total of more than 11 million students, will abandon school for the next year. And of course, the most affected areas in the world are the Southeast Asia, the South of Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And uh, just to close, there has been a deficit in the funding and the sustainable development goals regarding education up until the horizon of 2030. We are talking about the 2030 agenda, and we are talking about 1/3 of deficit in funding, which is estimated to be around 148 billion.
This is a theme that brings us great angst because the pandemics increases the gaps in education funding, and UNESCO has been warning to the urgent need, the prioritizing uh, investments by the government and private initiatives for the safe reopening of the schools, observing the situation of the pandemics in each of the areas. We have a second wave of the pandemic in Europe, in the United States, and since April, we have, along with UNICEF, the World Bank, uh, working on uh, the program for reopening schools. But more recently, we have been working with health organizations, and with UNICEF, we have launched a document about the considerations for health safety recommendations for reopening schools with correct procedures to be adopted when reopening the schools. But we have to remember that in this process, it is essential there is a dialogue between health and education. The schools need open spaces with air, proper structure, social distancing, paying attention to the students, the employees, monitoring new cases, not only among students, but among the teachers and professionals in the school, of the education institutions. So we have to pay attention to the social emotional health of all these employees. And we have to prepare these people to work with the students, and the students all around the world are stressed due to this long period away from school. They suffer with anxiety, depression, and many difficulties related to the interruption of the school system. So UNESCO, since we deal with objective number 4, the sustainable development goals, with regarding quality equitative education for all, it depends on systems that are inclusive, depends on the countries being committed to these goals. First, correcting distortions of the caused by inequalities that have been become greater with the pandemics. Social economic situation in Brazil already represented a barrier before the pandemics, and it's worsened during the year 2020. This week, I- I'm just finishing. I'm paying attention to my time. But this week, INEP has published results of SAEB for the ninth year of elementary school. analyzing human sciences and nature sciences, and the data is very concerning because according to the institution, 7.7, 70.7 of the students are below what was expected, which means that these students do not understand how important it is to use a condom to prevent AIDS, which is something that is very uh, concerning since we continue to have the spreading of the disease. This is also 52% of the students had very low grades below 250. So these are students that, in the context of the pandemics, are not able to understand how important it is to properly wash your hands, the importance of vaccines to prevent diseases, and only in 9 states students got higher average than this. And this is the Brazilian average. The pandemics also brought an additional concern. UNESCO has been working very close to the slums associations that has launched the survey done by the Institute Data Favela in a partnership with UNESCO, showing that more than half, 55% of the students in the slums have not been studying during the pandemics. So this is a great concern for us. And the main reasons that bring these students away from the remote school activities are the lack of a proper place to study, lack of internet connection, either because they don't have any or because they have a very bad connection. And finally, I want to mention the data published by the Regional Center of Study for the Development of Society Center, Category 2 of UNESCO, that shows that more than half, 56% of the university students and students older than 16 have stopped following the remote classes in the last 30 days because they needed to find a job to try to help with the family income. So it's more than not having access to connection or having a bad quality internet connection. That was 34%. Or the lack of proper equipment to follow the schools. That was 32%. And to close, and I would say that UNESCO is calling globally for a global coalition with the United Nations to try to find more partners among governments with the civil society and private institutions so we can together seek solutions to finance education. So this deficit that is of 1/3 might be solved, and so we can build educational systems that are safer, resilient, and better managed uh, when it comes to the preparation for risk situations such as the one we're living now, and trying to find paths that prioritize equal opportunities, pedagogic propositions that are updated using new technologies that are here to stay in teaching, qualification and valuing of teachers and managers, and as I said, better structuring the schools. Of course, the circumstances bring huge challenges, but we do need to find solutions together for a transformative education, considering the collective above the individual, and trying to find a way that the culture, the societies will develop a critical view to be able to find ways to transform our world. We are sure that this transforming education is possible, and we all need to be committed to that so that nobody is left behind. Thank you. Thank you, Marlova. It's very important for us to have this global view and link that all these big numbers and informations that you bring us with a human side of this problem. That's why we're going to talk to Professor Gina Vieira. She certainly knows this inequality situation in depth, since she was one of a person who broke this barrier. She was born in Ceilândia, one of the satellite cities of Brasilia. She likes to talk about that in all her speeches. It's something that is always moving. She's been a teacher for 29 years in the public system of our capital. She has a BA in arts, and she specialized in everything you can think of to provide quality education to people in situations of vulnerability. She studied inclusion, human development, uh, and all that. And she's a precious gem that we find working in schools. And we wanted to tell us how this inequality happens in the daily life in the schools, how this great impact of this current situation has affected your students and your work colleagues, the teachers who have sometimes done huge have faced difficulties to work. How can you help us understand this problem? Solutions can we think of so we can take the leap we need to get quality education for all, not leaving anyone behind? Uh, Gina, your audio, we can't hear you. Thank you, dear Anna. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to participate in this special moment, talking with all these young leaders. And I thank you for the opportunity to meet all these people who I have met during these 30 years working and striving for quality education. It's a pleasure to see you, Minister Paim, Priscila, Marlova, Anna. I want to start talking about the fact that first, before anything, landing on the Brazilian situation, Marlova brought the scenario of how the pandemics affected education around the world. And now I'm going to talk about our situation. First, we have to uh, compliment everybody on all the teachers and managers who have mobilized, who have been striving in the sense of ensuring that the kids did not suffer pedagogic problems during this period while the schools are closed. So we're here to just debate problems, inequalities, what to do to reach the sustainable development goals of the Agenda 2030. I feel some time ago it was seemed so distant, but we are only 10 years from it. And it's important for us to focus on what we need to advance. But I want to bring to acknowledge my colleagues, my teachers who, as Antonio Novo said, were the leaderships who have saved education during this time. Malova brought a point that I consider strategic and central to this debate, which is social inequality. And I second everything she mentioned, but I wanted to bring a reflection on the fact that in Brazil, our inequalities are very specific. They have been historically produced and intentionally produced. It was not something that happened by chance. We know that we had inequalities and didn't do anything for that. For 358 years, Brazil was a slaving country that tortured and killed people. And this is the main reason why Brazil is the second country that is most unequal in the world, because it not only tortured, showed, and killed Black people for 358 years during this slave system, but when the end of slavery 230 years ago was uh, signed, they build a country that where the rule of law is based on structural racism. A country that has created systematic laws that prohibit access to jobs, to education, laws that made it easier to send black people to jail. So, considering the situation in Brazil, it is impossible to talk about inequality without bringing a race uh, definition, a great picture. So the first is no surprise that the first victim of COVID-19 was a black house worker, which is a symbol of all this. So the kids that were most affected by the pandemics are black kids, indigenous kids, kids that lives on the margin of rivers, and the number of the remote students who had access to that, the number of white students is 3 times the number of other students who had access to remote education. And now I have to mention that when I'm talking here, I'm talking based on my experience, but I'm also presenting collectives of students in many other areas. I'm part of a collective called Teachers, Male and Female Teachers from Brazil, that congregates students from all states and who have been talking about these interruptions.
The school plays a very important social role because most of the times the school is the first institution that knows that there is something going on with a student. And if the person is out of school, the person is more vulnerable. So, if you remember, there was this a news on a girl that had to undergo abortion because she got pregnant on abuse, and and they just ignored the fact that the person could have been more assisted with in this school environment. So, if a school brings a quality humanitarian uh, education, there is no way we can other guarantee other means and other ways of assisting someone without the school. The right to live with no violence, the right to food and water. And I've heard stories of colleagues of mine questioning themselves, questioning whether their students could eat. And I am saying this in the sense that the school occupies a strategic place in that game. It's the first institution that accepts the child and is with the child every day. And with if the child is away from school, it causes lonely for the teachers and sometimes danger for the students. So there is no way to produce quality in education if we don't include intersector policies and we reach the baseline. It's important to say that at a critical moment like this, we cannot go without saying anything on the way how we have to fight inequality. We have students leaving school and abandoning school because they are remote, because they have to work to bring food to their tables. Another important thing to mention, and just checking the time I have, think I started 7 minutes ago. I think I have 1 more minute. Oh, 2 more minutes. You have 2 more minutes. Okay, thank you, dear. Something else I'd like to mention is the fact that when we talk about quality and we are talking considering the sustainable development goals, we are talking about quality education. And what is the education we are talking about? We are talking about pedagogical quality and the insurance of the right to education, but we are also talking about human quality, social quality, citizenship quality, and democratic quality. The pandemic has evidenced our inequalities, and that includes education. And one of them includes uh, the digital inclusion, and it's urgent and it cannot be postponed anymore. We have been postponing it for years. We are at school and we've been fighting for education and devices and training for quite a long time now, and the pandemics have shown how much this is important. The person is already excluded, and being even more excluded from the digital point of view is going to be bringing more problems. If the school doesn't bring possibilities for the digital world, that school is not dialoguing with the school of new era. And talking about human quality, another challenge we have, if we can ensure learning, is to overcome an educational logic that in some contents it is a colonial, uh, bank-like and authoritarian, in which learning is ensuring the person has homework to do, for example. So the professor is depositing information, and the students are taking information as as being a deposit for that. So this relationship has to be rethought, and this is what prepares everyone for learning. In order to address quality, we need to qualify this debate and say, what type of quality are you talking about? Um, an education that is inclusive and committed to equality, democratic. There is no such there is no equal education if you do not ensure equal conditions for learning and access. We have a very long way, but we start by giving visibility and addressing our problem and showing the problems and what can we build all together. I'm going to stop now. We're going to continue this dialogue. We kindly ask you, bring your questions so that we can continue this debate. The questions are already coming in. The presentations are very provocative, and this is natural that we have questions. Now I'll handle the floor to Priscila Cruz. She is the president of Todos, Pela Educação. She holds an MA in public administration, and then she finds out that it was not her heart was not beating for the companies. Her heart was beating for public administration as she went to Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And Priscilla is today one of the most prominent voices on the dialogue on education, and she's an opinion former, and she's leader of several organizations. Priscila, Todos pela Educação has produced many documents, and some of us have taken part in that collective construction, continuing the candidates for president, and now with Educação Já, and we have developed that with the municipalities. What is importance of having those politicians being involved in this debate and adding to the with evidence and resources? So apart from talking about decision making on public policies, how can we ensure financing of the public education through Fundeb, the Basic Educational Maintenance and Development Fund? They are heading towards a regulation, and how can we ensure that the cities do receive resources for children and adolescents to be able to go to school and assess quality school in education? Priscilla? Well, thank you, Anna. Very nice introduction. I'd like to thank you and thank you for the invitation for being here. And I am always, every time I am very sad that we are not together, but we will soon be. So I'd like to greet Marlova and Gina and Minister Paim, and the joy of being here to debate and the possibility of this unification for us to discuss the inequality on education and education as a tool, as a vector for the fight against this inequality and how to address this. I'm going to answer your question, and I will also build up from the previous speakers, which I found really great. I agree with everything that has been said so far. So I am going to continue with this perspective and add to your dialogue. And I thank everyone who is watching as well and for being involved in this. You who are interested in Brazil and interested in making Brazil a great country for real, so that we can overcome the unbelievable statistics we have, this cultural involvement, and how to overcome this inequality that is huge, and what is maculating in our country, and we need to overcome this. And I believe, and this is not only a wishful thinking, I believe, and I'm included in that. We are in a generation that are thinking Brazil, and it encompasses many ages. We are the ones who are going to put this theme on the table of the fight on inequality in this country. And we need this spaces like this to be able to debate and to form coalitions and form collective groups so that we can strengthen this fight. And using Marlova's word, I'm anguished and perplexed. We need steadier steps towards inequality. And there's no better way than through education. And Gina, acknowledging the inequality comes from other directions as well. So we need to understand that this is a complex systems in which all parts feed each other. We need to move towards a better country together for everyone, with less inequality and with equal opportunities. That's no doubt. So from building up from everything we've heard until now, and I help you very much because I won't have to repeat many of the things you've said. I'm going to talk about public policies. Gina brought the school perspective, and Marlova brought the international perspective. But to think of Brazil, we need public policies. There is no way to create a way to strongly leverage the country towards less inequality and quality education, or uh, equality for all. We need a contemporary educational system with a lot of dimensions of development of the child and the young people and their wishes and citizenship and democracy and all. We need many things to leverage this, but we need public policies. In Brazil, 80% of the people the young people are going to public schools and 20% in private schools. It's important to acknowledge that the large scale pathway is going to happen when we have powerful public policies that are very well created, very well implemented, and continuously improved. This is the challenge we have in our country, and not disregarding the initiatives that add to the public policies and they happen in the different territories of the country. But there is a long path we have to go through, which is the educational public policy that is strong with a very clear agenda so that we can advance. With that said, and to add to what Marlova said, we were coming from a large inequality in education. Yesterday, Folha de São Paulo published a study that shows that from 2015 to 2019, 58% of the cities showed an increase in inequality among their schools. And when we see this, is that we see the schools that uh, serve the higher income families, they have advanced much more than the ones who accept the low income students. And I'll just elaborate further on what to do this. But this is a result of a public policy and the way it is carried out that is not engaged with the inequality situation. if we need to raise the quality level, but we need to make sure that equality comes along with it. We need to focus more attention with a more specific strategy for the most vulnerable students who are more vulnerable. And I'm also going to talk about this further on. But we are coming from a situation in which this inequality was already big and it is increasing. And the pandemics, like everyone else, it augmented all these problems and this inequality. Although we do not have the data on this, and I'm going to use this space just to say this lack of information we are living in the country today, and the lack of coordination is something it is the reflect of an absent Ministry of Education playing the Poncio Pilates and mitigating the effects of the pandemic. This is very acute in Brazil and some other places in the world. We don't know exactly the size of this inequality, but we can sort of measure because of the different conditions of the children, the difference in conditions they have during the pandemics. And this is generating inequality the same way it is also resulting in a reduction on learning.
And the other results we hope education to produce, as Gina says, we don't have a specific evaluation for that as on a national basis, but what we have been noticing is that all this, the development of all this is hindered because the kids and youngsters are uh, quarantined at home with different situations and going to stress that can compromise their health, uh, their emotional health. From now on, we hear a lot of stories of self-mutilation, increase of suicide thoughts. We're living a very dramatic situation that affects the kids and youngsters who are more vulnerable and not by chance are the black kids. They are suffering more than the others during the pandemic, and this was something that had been going on since before the pandemic. It's not as if the inequalities came up during the pandemic. Have a history of inequality that is long-standing. 28% of the students are thinking of not going back to school when schools reopen. So 28% of our youngsters giving up their educations. In addition to the consequences to their lives, there's a huge consequence to their regions, to our country, and especially to those youngsters. This is one of the things that really hurts me, that touches me deeply. This evasion that affects, or where you have a greater risk of that. In the population, there's more vulnerable, the poorer students, black students, students who are handicapped, students who are already more vulnerable than the others, and they are being more affected than the others. And this will certainly lead us to greater inequality. This scares me. So we have in 58% of the cities have increased their inequality in terms of education. So I'm not going to bother you with lots of data, but Minister Paim has followed up on the development and the way we built the EDAB. It's an important indicator. It's not the only one used for quality, but it's an important measure. But in the last couple of years, it is a survey done every 2 years. The last one among the 570 cities in Brazil, we had a decrease in the country. So in not only in the networks we have the inequality is growing, but between different networks. Some states have been improving their index, being able to deliver quality education that is a right for all children and youngsters. So after some effort, some financing, after 2 years, we now have a decrease in this index. Again, we have an increase of the inequalities, and the pandemic has worsened this situation even more between states, between cities. Some states worked more extensively on remote education than the cities. Some city networks, you have some difference. So if inequality was already a problem with the pandemic, it has become a huge and urgent problem that needs to be solved. So we need to solve that at a national level. So how do we face that? There's not one single agenda for that. We have to employ different and converging efforts on that. We have to organize the different parties that participate in that so we can ensure quality education in a broader sense for children and young people in Brazil all around the country, regardless of where they are, what their race is, if they are, what is their gender, or if they are handicapped or not. So for us to ensure that Todos para Educação is part of an effort that needs to be greater, a greater effort, even coordinating with the Ministry of Education, which is not happening recently, but organizations such as UNESCO and other organizations are working on that. They are putting out their best efforts, along with some governments on the states and cities. They are employing great effort to ensure that the effects of the pandemics can be mitigated. And don't not forgetting to mention what Gina has already said, are concerned with the education professionals all around the country. So we have in our organization, Todos para Educação, the document that we wrote focused on 2030, talking about national educations, and we're not talking about the national government, the Brazilian government. We're talking about at national level, comprising different branches of the government, and more recently we have Educação Já Cities, which is a document that is working with the candidates for mayor and city legislators that are participating in this elections that we will have now in Brazil. So we have been working with them, with some foundations connected to the parties, carrying many activities so that at least an important part of these future mayors are well prepared on the first day of their management, the first day of their term, for a huge task. It's not because we're talking not only about mitigating these effects, but we're talking about bringing progress to education. We're not trying to restart educational policies. We're talking about transforming education. We don't want to go back to where it stopped. Don't want to go back to the point where education was in March this year because it was already not good. So can we transform this? How can we bring when we go back to classes, how can we turn that into an opportunity to transform Brazilian education with more energy, and as the question that Ana Penido mentioned, with a management that looks to the evidence, that analyzes the policies that are related to this quality education for all that we aspire. More quality, a more equal education with more opportunities, better results in many dimensions, as Gina mentioned. One of these policies, and I'm already connecting this to FUNDEP, which is the Basic Education Maintenance and Development Fund. It is a fund that organizes and distributes elementary education funds through some cities. Some cities have a very low revenues in that, so they have less funds, and some states have higher revenues. So Fundeb, which is Minister Paim can mention more about that. He was one of the creators of Fundeb. I'm mentioning Indeb and Fundeb, which were two institutions that you have created, Minister Paim. So he brought the symbolic idea of getting an initiative from a former government, expanding it, improving it, and making it even more important for Brazilian education. So now we have the new Fundeb, and one of the keys of this fund, and bringing me to a close, this is one of the keys we have to build a more equitable education. Having intentionally fighting inequalities when we draw public policies. This is the most important issues. We can talk about diagnosis for a long time, but we need public policies that intentionally want to fight inequalities. And Fundeb is a very positive example in that. It directs more funds to the schools that cater to a poorer community. So kids that are poorer will receive more funds. So the intention is to redistribute all that. And this is the mark of this new Fundeb, promoting greater equality when providing funds to the public school networks around Brazil. And I'm going to close with that because this intentional drive in the policies have to be based on a very important principle. We need to give more to those who need more, those who have to employ more effort to get progress. So we need more funds, we need more greater technical support. I'm sorry, Mr. Minister Paim, if I keep mentioning you. So what are the public networks that are more behind and require more financial and technical support? So to have that in our country, you have to have the courage to decide for those who need most, who are more vulnerable. This is easy to say and hard to do, but Fundeb is a great example of a public policy that was built in the House of Representatives, but that was built based on a decision to drive funds to those who are more vulnerable. This is very hard. It's very hard for any institution in the country to let go of funds. But what we managed to get players in the federal network to give resources to those who need most. So Fundeb is a successful policy that should inspire effectively all the work done so we can bring this principle to other policies. Because if we don't invest more in those who need most, we'll only enhance the inequalities we already see in our society and in education. So I want to close with this. Anna, you have the floor. Thank you, Priscila. We'll quickly pass the floor on to Minister José Henrique Paim. He says that only his mother calls him José Henrique, but we always called him Minister Paim, Executive Secretary Paim. But he has occupied many positions in the Ministry of Education. He was responsible for drawing many of the policies that are considered progress in Brazilian education. And therefore, the question we have for him is in that direction. It's important to say that today he works in Fundação Getúlio Vargas as a professor, as in the development of education policies. And I know many people who are going to work with him, and I really expect great things from him. But what we want to hear from you is, what are these progresses that we have managed to achieve and we cannot lose when talking about Brazilian education? And what are the warning signs regarding policies that need to be enhanced, things that you didn't really manage to put forward, but that are part of the evolution? So what do you need to preserve? Where do you need to invest attention, not only by the public powers, but by the civil society, so we don't lose this path we were coming on? We don't have audio, Minister. You need to open your mic. First, I want to thank a lot for this invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in this debate. I want to say hello to everybody, say good afternoon and good evening to all of you. And it's a pleasure to be here with people who are so important and are a reference to me. Priscila, Marlova, Gina, who has participated in many debates with me in other opportunities, and Anna, who's a reference to all of us.
In reality, along those years, we have had some advancement regarding access and equality. But when we look at the governments on education in Brazil, we see that clearly there is a complexity in this governance from the perspective on how Brazil organizes itself with the unification of states and cities if you compare to other federalist countries. And this is very peculiar. We have a degree of decentralization that is very high and a need for convergence of a national policy. Because although we have an autonomous way of managing things on a municipal level with autonomy, we also have the need for the national directives to be issued by the Ministry of Education, by the House of Representatives, so that the cities and states can formulate and implement their own policies. At the same time, we have the need, an urgent need for the federal government to play an important role uh, to supplement and distribute, as it says in the Constitution and our basic education law. This is a role that needs to be played, and this is a moment that is just so difficult. And we see that there is a mission that ends up causing problems to cities and states. But I could say that along these years, we have made some small advancements from the access point of view and of the quality, and in some other aspects that concern civil society, including what Priscilla says. In the implemented public policies, if we wished we had a design that could cover for the cities and states that are unprivileged. And with time, we could reduce the inequalities. And this has been happening in Brazil. This is what is happening here. Priscilla mentioned very correctly the data from IDEB regarding the cities, and we have the situation. And of course, we have noticed we have made some advancements in a very important sense, which is regarding the number of states that are demonstrating what we call management towards learning. They have created through in time a culture of supervising. It brings awareness of teachers in class, so that they follow up on students and not leaving students behind. When we are talking about learning, uh, the education has to be for all. And this is a very important aspect to be considered. And then the school principal following up the development of the performance of each class, and the regional education offices and the state offices also following up with every school. And this is what is going to encompass this school supervision. So focusing on learning so that students can achieve their learning goals. And we see this clearly because we used to have cases of Espírito Santos, Goiás, but we have some other states who have advanced, Alagoas, Piauí, Bahia. In Bahia, there was a very difficult situation, but we managed to bring some hope to them. And in Maranhão, the same thing. And this is something that we have to do. And this is a result of a work that is being done. And this is the final result to date. But of course, we need to gain more space. And the approval of Fundeb was just so important to change the funding scenario of Brazil with concerns to equity. And this is fundamental. And another characteristic we see in these states is that apart from the management towards learning, the managers have started addressing a systemic look. And this is clearly showing that the education that they have to manage is the education as a whole in the state. So what we see is more and more states working very strongly, working their relationship with the cities, helping with financial situations so that the cities can advance. And we have to understand very clearly that for the families and for the citizen, it for them, they don't matter whether it's a municipal or state management site. And we just can notice that gradually we are seeing examples towards this direction. All along these years, we have created some of the basic conditions for the educational system to work, whether they are in the state or in the city. And this allowed us to focus much more on inclusion and education. We need to see how these basic conditions work in the network, and I also bring more information. We are talking about school meals, we are talking about transportation, we are talking about infrastructure as well, but we cannot forget that during this pandemic and post-pandemic, this acceleration of system into digital, and we're going to use these tools more and more, and this is going to be a reality. We have to consider that the digital inclusion has to involve student assistance. It's not only school meal or transportation. Access to internet has to be in that list as well. The students need to have access to the internet, whether at school or at home. It is important. It is needed. It needs to be included in what needs to be provided by the federal government. And this is regarding the internet access. And what we see and what is being presented here is that when we consider the period of study, and my friend Marcelo Neves has discussed this, And the wealthier families and families with more income power, they had time for everything because they have access to the internet, they have resources, and there is no way we can compare, especially during the pandemic, what we have in a situation of public school and inequality, not only associated to income, but also social. This is an important point that needs to be addressed, and we to make advancements on this to ensure that access to information is changed. If you change the perspective of schools, as Castell said, we need to change uh, the absolutism of schools, and it encompasses other levels. We need to work towards this direction and try to access this internet matter. And the major concern, just to conclude, the major situation we have to consider is that the states and cities work the active search for their resources, and we had a problem of students failing their years, and it was a problem that was before very well addressed, but it's happening. And school dropout is decreasing. We have to work more and more towards preparing the network for the resumption of schools. Each and every student at home cannot be harmed anymore. I'd say that I consider myself as an educator, especially because I was involved in this, but we need to pay attention to this concern of equality, and we need to have strength from teachers who have overcome their own situations, but we also need presence of the federal government in this process. Thank you, Paim. Thank you, all of you. We have some public questions just to extend our conversation a little longer. But considering we are heading towards the end, I'm just directly address each question to each of you. And you can have a round of final considerations of 1 or 2 minutes, and then you can say goodbye and at the same time give your perspective on the question. I think that everything that you've said is very clear, and I thank you very much for considering your answer towards your final considerations, because we're not talking about inequalities, we are talking about specificities. There's no way we can go by without understanding particularities of each city, every school. We need to think of resource distribution, teacher training, students and their real needs, the needs of every student who is attending school in Brazil. And standardization has only increased inequalities. It is about the redistribution. It's rethinking every element that is a part of what we call education. This is what is needed towards the leap of to the reduction of inequality. And Marlova, Bela Fema has made a consideration, and she asks you to think of the on how to access quality when we have to fight school dropout, and we are talking about quantity at this level, because accessing, we thought we had advanced on accessing, but we may have retreated a little bit on this. How do we consider school dropout and the fight against it versus quality? And Gina, you've mentioned inequalities at economic and social levels, and Daniela Dani is asking, and how about gender matters at school? How is this addressed? And the importance of this debate. And a question to Priscila and to Paim coming from George Vartime. Why is education not yet a priority for Brazilians? So, with all that said, in a more general way, each of you have 2 minutes to answer that. starting with Marlova. Well, I think the challenge of combining quality and we have lost audio. Marlova, we cannot hear you. Is anything off there? I started by listening to you, but then your voice just was muted. Can you hear me now? Yes. What I was saying is that in Brazil, in a way, we sort of know how to combine the permanent search for quality and access. In the 90s, Brazil managed to solve the access problem. I remember Antonio Carlos Gomes, and I miss him. He posed a challenge that encompasses access, success, and regress. And we are leaving the regress phase, and we are trying to bring the student and the apprentice had a problem on active search, bringing students back to school. And the quality, that one is still important, and it has a lot of demands. And many of us have mentioned the many forms Brazil have been searching for this, because the quality challenge is directly related to the reduction of inequalities and inclusion, and the search for an equalitarian education, because opportunities are not the same for everyone.
So I believe that there is a great effort to be made and that the country is able to combine all the things we need to get quality education. Observing at the moment requires more looking, as I said in my initial speech, looking at the need of having resilient education system that are attentive to risk management, thinking about qualification for the teachers and many other matters that might help us to build this quality education the country needs. Thank you, Marlova. Gina, Daniela wants to know you address the matter of inequalities regarding ethnicity, socioeconomic, and race issues. What about the gender matters? How important is the debate about it in the schools when you're talking about reducing inequalities and quality education? Thank you very much for this question. It's a very important question, and it has to do with the sustainable development goals. And since one of them talks about gender equality, I think it's goal number 5. Of course, it's very close to quality education because, in fact, gender is a central issue. Debating inequality as uh, misogyny is as central to the structure as racism. It has been present since the slave times until today, and in our culture, we still have many practices that signal that girls can leave school to work in their homes, to take care of their siblings, to help at home. I have watched the launching of a report on the situation of girls, and it's shocking to see that in most countries in the world, when a girl turns 10, she's no longer seen as a person that has rights and is then seen by someone who will be explored as child job for early marriage. This girl will be removed from school. So this is very alarming all around the world and in Brazil when you talk about gender, because we still have a very father-centered culture where there's no need to support girls so they continue school. We do need an agenda to promote equality, understanding that the demands for women is different from that for girls. And when we're talking about educations, we need to talk about public policies with a gender and race perspective. So when we're talking about that, we need to ask ourselves if the girls are coming back to school after the pandemics, or have they been absorbed by the job market to work as nannies, because in the collective imaginary, it's worse to lose a boy from school than a girl dropping out. So we do need structure to promote inclusion of these girls. And I want to highlight another matter. This gender matter, it also has to do with our faculty members. Most professionals in school are women. And the terrible conditions in the qualification of teachers have to do with that. You understand that most women will work with education, but more on with a focus of caretaking than really knowledge development. So we cannot talk about fighting inequalities if you don't talk about structural misogyny. Priscila and Paim, so why is education not a priority in Brazil? And why don't we demand, as a society, demand the reduction of inequalities in education? Priscila, uh, I'll start here and I'll talk very quickly because I think this is a debate that is ongoing. I thank you, uh, George, for your question. We have talked about that before. This involves many factors and a combination of many factors that explains the fact that we cannot put basic elementary education as a priority in Brazil. We have other very important agenda that are put before education, but education is a priority when you talk about it. If it does some survey around and ask if education is important, you have close to 100% of the people saying yes, it is important. It's essential. It's the most important thing for the country. You always have this discourse, but in reality, you cannot put that into effect. It is not translated into effective actions that prioritize education in Brazil. So it has a historical root, and when you're studying that, I always recommend the work of Renato Ferissetti from FEA USP, History of Education and Why It's Not a Priority. And he fights the idea and he says, it's not that idea is not a priority in general, but he studied letters written by mothers, black mothers who were slaves, asking the mayor or the similar figure in that area, demanding public school for their children. Mothers always demanded education in school for their children, but historically, education had been of lower governments, state and city governments, and the federal government would be responsible for higher education. So that explains why education has not always been a priority, because at the time the cities were responsible for that, and the cities have very lower revenues than the federal government. So it has historical root. There's always a difference between the timing in education and policy. We understand that the public manager needs to present results so he can be reelected and he can climb political positions in the states. And the time education produces results is different. it's not, it has nothing to do with the electoral uh, agenda, the electoral timing. So this has happened on and on. We have all observed that. So the question is, what can I do during my term that it will produce a perspective that people will see it as progress? And education takes more time to produce results. At least in a way you can more clearly notice. The results will come up if they are well, the measures are well implemented. So we have a tendency to feel, to imagine situations in the future. We think, when you think of education, we know that it will affect all areas of the society and cause a great number of problems. We don't have the optimism of seeing results from education. And Dr. Janet has a book that is very nice in that, and talks about this cognitive bias that brings a difficulty of planting in the future something that will only bring fruits in the future. This difficulty we have of projecting a long-term future is hard, and education requires us to think about the future. Marlova talked about Antonio Gomes das Rochas. He talked about the imaginary that calls you to action, something that will call you to work today on something that will only bring results in the future. This is a difficulty that everybody has, and I want to close to saying that it's a false perception of the real effect of education. It seems like education is for my kid, so he will have a better job. Education has effects in many other aspects. I want to also say goodbye and thank for participating in this conference. Thank you very much. Thank you, Priscila. If Minister Paim, if you could explore a bit more about the importance of the civil society and these policies related to education. I first want to thank for the question from George. We're always talking about that. And I want to say that, in fact, we had moments in Brazil where the educational agenda ended up being leveraged along with greater concerns regarding economic development of Brazil. But I'd say that at one of these moments was the creation, was in 2006. I was one of the creators of the the first assembly of the institution. We had a very strong movement from the society in the sense of bringing educational agenda as a central issue for the country to climb to being a great nation. I think the society has a very important role in Brazil. In the society, has a very important role, an essential role in our situation. Today, we don't have an agenda regarding education based on government policies, but at the same time, we notice that there's a strengthening of the third sector in the sense of supporting government policies. We see that as a very interesting movement that is happening. And I'd say that this combination of an educational agenda with the economic development agenda is something that we need to build in Brazil. Brazil needs to work harder in that sense. And history has proved this. When we combined when we separated economic development from education development, we paid a high price. So we have to mobilize civil society so this agenda is put back into its important place. We've had some progress in this area with Fundeb, with the national educational system, which has been brought by the movement from the society to the House of Representatives. Thank you. I want to thank Minister Paim, Gina, Marlova, Priscila. Thank you all. Thank you for the audience for being here and for your questions. Just to answer Susanna Schneider, what is the place of private schools in this fight for inequality? I think more and more private schools have inclusion policies to receive uh, more students who are black, who are from vulnerable situations, and to bring debates on educational policies in Brazil. So with this, I say goodbye to all of you. I want to thank you all and thank the students and alumni from Science Pool who are volunteers in this event, but are great professionals. It was a pleasure to participate in so high level discussion with all this technology that has allowed us to debate with people from all parts of the world and reach people who are all around the world. So let us continue putting our efforts together to address education problems in Brazil.